On the west coast of Ireland, a face that breaks every postcard you have ever seen. Jet black hair, pale, almost glowing skin, eyes the color of shallow ocean water. And every story about it is wrong. 4. The phrase Black Irish has been whispered in villages and talked about in pubs for generations, without anyone agreeing on what it really means or where it really came from. The popular theories are familiar enough. A group of Spanish ships wrecked on the Irish coast in 1588. Norse raiders who mixed their family lines into a conquered people. Medieval knights who never quite left. Each explanation had just enough believability to survive. None of them had enough proof to hold up. Modern DNA analysis has now gone somewhere none of those stories could follow, into the bones themselves, into the genetic record that came before every shipwreck, every invasion, every dynasty, by thousands of years. What it found does not simply correct the old myths. It replaces them entirely. The truth is older than Ireland as anyone has ever imagined it, and it changes everything. The Spanish Armada story is the one that stuck. In 1588, the most powerful naval fleet of its age sailed against England, got destroyed by storms, and scattered its wreckage along the Irish coastline. Dozens of ships went down. Survivors dragged themselves ashore, dark-haired and olive-skinned, so visibly different from the pale locals that the stories wrote themselves. They stayed, the legend says. They married, they had children, and somewhere in those children the Black Irish were born. It is a beautiful story. It is also genetically invisible. Modern DNA studies find no measurable Spanish signal in the Irish population that can be traced back to that event. Math was always the problem. A few dozen shipwreck survivors scattered across a coastline cannot change the makeup of a national gene pool. Romance was never the issue. The scale was. The Viking theory carries more real evidence. Norse raiders hit Ireland hard between the 9th and 11th centuries, founded Dublin, and settled the eastern coastal towns. Genetic surveys confirm that a notable share of Irish men carry Scandinavian Y chromosome lines. That is real. That is measurable. But that signal is concentrated in the east, in the cities the Vikings built. Not in Kerry or Cork or Galway, where the Black Irish look is most often found. The Norman conquest of the 12th century leaves an even smaller mark. Mostly Eastern, mostly aristocratic, mostly limited to a handful of noble surnames. None of these stories reach far enough back. The real answer needs a completely different scale of time. To find the real answer, you have to leave the medieval world entirely and travel back to Ireland around 2500 BC. Stone circles rising on hillsides. Neolithic farmers working the land. Their Mediterranean ancestors had settled on the island thousands of years earlier. A people with their own genetic signature, their own family lines, their own deep roots in the soil of the island. A world that was about to be erased. The Beaker people arrived from continental Europe, carrying advanced metalwork, special pottery, and something far more important than either, new DNA. Archaeologists and geneticists now agree on what happened next. It was not gradual blending. It was not peaceful mixing. When the Beaker culture reached Britain and Ireland, it replaced almost all of the existing people within a few centuries. Whatever mix of migration, displacement, and population collapse caused that change, the result was total. The Ireland that existed before the Beaker arrival essentially ceased to exist. The evidence is not abstract. On Rathlin Island, off Ireland's north coast, researchers dug up the remains of Bronze Age men buried around 2500 to 2000 BC. When their DNA was studied, they carried the R1b L21 haplogroup. The same paternal line is found in over 65% of Irish men alive today. Those bones were not ancient strangers. They were the direct ancestors of the modern Irish people. The Beaker arrivals also carried the gene for lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood. In a land where dairy became a main food source, that gene spread until Ireland had the highest frequency of it anywhere on Earth. They also carried versions of the genes for lighter skin and eyes. Those traits spread quickly, but the genes for dark hair did not disappear. They held on. In certain communities, in certain family lines, they did something more than survive. They flourished. And that is where the Black Irish story actually begins. The Bronze Age transformation reshaped Ireland through its fathers. The Y chromosome passed from man to son across generations like a surname written in biology and tells the story of that break clearly. But there is a second record, a quieter one. And to understand the full picture of the Black Irish, you have to listen to what the mothers carried. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, unchanged across generations unless a mutation happens. It is one of the most stable records in human genetics. And in Ireland, what it shows is remarkable continuity. The most common maternal haplogroup in Ireland today is H, carried by a large share of Irish women. Studies suggest upward of a third, with its strongest concentrations in the smaller branches H1 and H3. These family lines trace directly back to early European farmers and Bronze Age migrants. Irish mothers have been carrying the same DNA for thousands of years, but even older signals survive alongside them. A notable minority of Irish women carry haplogroup U, one of the most ancient maternal lines in Europe. A branch called U5 connects modern Irish women to the first humans who set foot on the island after the Ice Age. Women who hunted and fished along Ireland's wild coastline more than 7,000 years ago. Their DNA is still here. Here is what makes this matter for the Black Irish mystery. Many of these maternal family lines show their closest modern matches not to Britain, but to France, Iberia, and the wider Atlantic coast. Ancient sea connections, seafaring routes that carried entire families into Ireland long before any Viking ship appeared on the horizon. Some of those lines carried versions of pigmentation genes that kept dark hair alive even as lighter traits spread across the population. Ireland's fathers brought transformation. Ireland's mothers preserved what came before. Together, they built the genetic range that makes everything possible. If you want to see the Black Irish face, you go west. Kerry, Cork, Galway, lands of stone walls and Atlantic cliffs, and families who have worked the same valleys for more generations than anyone has bothered to count. There is something different about these places. Not just culturally, not just historically, genetically different. And modern science has now confirmed what anyone paying attention already suspected. In 2017, the Irish DNA Atlas Project, led by researchers from the Royal College of Surgeons and Trinity College Dublin, studied people whose grandparents were all from the same regions of Ireland. What they found broke apart the idea of a single, uniform Irish population. Ireland broke into 10 separate genetic clusters. The majority of them strongly showed Gaelic Irish ancestry, and the most ancient, most distinctive clusters of all were concentrated in the West. Counties like Kerry and Cork showed stronger genetic continuity with Bronze Age Ireland than anywhere else on the island. The same legacy visible in those Rathlin Island remains, the same family lines that arrived during the Beaker transformation and never left. While most of Ireland carries a measurable Norwegian-like ancestry piece from centuries of Viking settlement, the western clusters often carried much less. Later arrivals barely touched them. They stayed closer to their Bronze Age ancestors than to their own eastern neighbors. Isolation does specific things to a gene pool. Scientists call it the founder effect. When a small group is cut off from outside influence across enough generations, rare traits do not just survive, they grow more common. The unusual pigmentation combinations that produce black hair alongside pale skin and light eyes had exactly the environment they needed in the west of Ireland to become a stable, repeating feature of whole communities. Culture added to what geography protected. The West was the stronghold of the Irish language, of Gaelic music and tradition, of communities that married within tight networks across centuries. Cultural strength and genetic strength moved in the same direction for a very long time. When you see the Black Irish face in the West, you are not looking at something strange. You are looking at the oldest continuously preserved genetic legacy on the island. The genetic mechanism behind all of this comes down to a single gene, MC1R. It is the main switch controlling hair and skin color in humans. And Ireland has the most unusual relationship with it of any population on Earth. Variants of MC1 are responsible for red hair. The specific changes called R151C, R160W, and D294H each raise the chance of red hair and freckles. And Ireland carries the highest concentration of these variants anywhere in the world. That is why roughly 10% of the Irish population has naturally red hair, when the global average sits below 2%. The variants are really that common, but this is where the usual explanation breaks down. Carrying an MC1 or variant does not guarantee red hair. Pigmentation is not a single switch. It is a tug-of-war between competing systems. On one side, melanin production genes push toward dark hair. On the other side, MC1 or changes weaken the melanin signal. Whoever wins that contest decides what color hair actually grows. Someone can carry a red hair variant and still have jet black hair if their melanin production genes are strong enough to override it. This is not unusual. It is happening in Irish families everywhere. A sibling with hair the color of flame sitting next to a sibling with hair the color of midnight. Same parents, same gene pool, different outcome from the same underlying contest. The dark pigmentation alleles driving that outcome are not recent arrivals. Ancient DNA confirms they were present in Ireland during the Neolithic period, carried by Mediterranean farmers thousands of years before the Bronze Age change introduced lighter traits. The two systems met, competed, and never fully settled. The black Irish face is not something brought in from elsewhere. It is what happens when ancient genetics refuses to lose. Irish surnames are not just names. They are biological records. Carry the right one, and you are carrying, without knowing it, a genetic signature that has been passed down through centuries of dynasties, invasions, famines, and survival. The name on the headstone and the DNA in the bone often tell the same story. Take the Uí Néill dynasty. For centuries, they held political power across large parts of Ireland, claiming descent from the legendary King Néill of the Nine Hostages. Genetic studies suggest that a substantial share of men in northwest Ireland share the same Y chromosome lineage, a branch of the R1b L21 haplogroup that traces directly back to that ruling line. One dynasty, one genetic signal, still visible across an entire region more than 1,000 years later. And that region sits squarely in the west and northwest, the same geography most often linked to the black Irish appearance. But dynasties are only part of the story. Tragedy wrote the other part. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 collapsed Ireland's population from roughly 8 million to 4 million in less than 10 years. Death and immigration emptied entire villages. The genetic consequence was harsh and simple. When half a population disappears, the DNA of those who remain gets amplified. Rare traits that might have stayed rare instead become defining features of the surviving community. In Western Ireland, where isolation had already gathered unusual pigmentation genes across generations, the famine acted as a final filter. The hemochromatosis mutation tells the same story from a different angle, often called the Celtic curse. This variant causes the body to store too much iron. It is common enough to be dangerous today, but it was likely a survival advantage in times of constant food scarcity. It appears at its highest global frequency in Western Ireland. Its deep roots in the Irish population suggest origins going back well before recorded history. It is a reminder that the genetics shaping the black Irish face are the genetics of people who endured things that would have ended other populations entirely. Modern genomics gave the final layer of confirmation, not through one study or one finding, but through the accumulated weight of autosomal DNA analysis. The mixed genetic material inherited from both parents, applied across large Irish population samples and measured against the wider European record. The picture that came out was clear. Ireland's ancestry breaks into three ancient streams. Estimates suggest roughly a third traces to Western hunter-gatherers who returned to the island after the Ice Age pulled back. Roughly another third or more comes from early European farmers who sailed north from the Mediterranean, bringing crops, livestock, and dark pigmentation variants that never fully disappeared. The remaining portion arrived with steppe pastoralists whose Bronze Age migration reshaped the whole continent. That three-way balance has stayed essentially stable for nearly 4,000 years. Few populations anywhere in Europe can claim that kind of continuity. The later arrivals left their marks, but not evenly. Viking influence concentrated in eastern coastal cities. Norman signs appeared mostly in aristocratic eastern family lines. The Ulster plantation left its mark in the north. The West absorbed almost none of it. What modern genomics confirmed is exactly what the geography and the oral traditions had always suggested. The western counties of Ireland were never overwritten. The oldest genetic layers survived intact. And the black Irish face looking back from those Atlantic communities is not a mystery that needs an explanation. It is simply the oldest face in Ireland. Still there, still recognizable after 4,000 years. That face on the west coast of Ireland was never something strange, never a genetic accident, never the leftover trace of a shipwreck or a raid. It is the most direct, living connection to the people who built the stone circles, who survived the Bronze Age change, who held their family lines together through isolation and famine, and everything history threw at a small island on the edge of the Atlantic world. The myths were always more comfortable than the truth. Spanish sailors made for a better story than 4,000 years of unbroken genetic continuity. Vikings made for a more dramatic explanation than the quiet persistence of Neolithic pigmentation variants in communities that simply never got mixed enough to lose them. The romantic story survived because nobody had read the bones carefully enough to replace them. The DNA has now been read, and what it says is not complicated. The Black Irish were never foreign, never mysterious, never the product of some outside force passing through and leaving its mark. They are the original face of the island, kept safe in the West by geography and culture and the special toughness of survival. Identity is never as simple as a stereotype insists. The same island that gave the world its redheads kept something older underneath. It was always there. It just took science long enough to confirm what the west of Ireland never actually forgot.